Recently, to celebrate April Fool's Day, Relogic released a new version of Terraria. Kind of. This version is called the UNDELUXE edition, which is actually just one of the first ever versions of Terraria re-released onto Steam. And since I'm currently working on 2 big videos that won't be out until the end of the month, I thought it'd be the perfect time to spend 100 days in this version of Terraria, which is exactly what I do in this video. Before I start though, I just want to quickly give a massive thanks to everyone who's joined my Discord server, as we just hit 10,000 members! We also finally got our customized invite link, so now not only can you find the server by searching up Terraria in the server Discord tab in Discord, but you can also join by using the discord.gg/Terraria Slime. With that out of the way though, let's finally jump into the playthrough. I started off by making my solid blue player, since I don't have my special vanity set in this version. Made a small world, and once I was finally in it, I started working on getting wood to make my first house. You may have realized that the game looks like it's zoomed out to the max, but in reality, this version doesn't have a zoom in option at all, making this the default. Getting wood was extremely slow, but once I felt like I had enough, I made my first house, which is also when I realized there is no NPC tab, and they also don't have the flag in the houses they move into, so I was gonna have to keep up with the NPCs by myself. After that, I decided to go find a cave to start looking for stuff underground, and ended up finding a cave not too far away from my house. Aside from a few chests that didn't have too much loot, I ended up finding the gold and iron I needed, a life crystal that I could only break using a hammer, and a cloud in a bottle. After that, I went back home and crafted some better tools, alongside some chests. And after I made another house and got the merchant to move in, I got right back to exploring my world. But this time, I went past the cave and ended up finding my corruption biome, which is the only evil biome in this version. Once I got to the end of the biome though, I ended up going up a hill, which is where I could see the bottom of a floating island, so I built my way up there. In this version, the floating islands would be based around an ore, have a locked chest, and even have some ore in the ground of the island, which is what I started getting, since I couldn't get into the locked chest yet. After this, I decided to go back to my base and make some more houses for the NPCs, alongside a little safe room for the area I spawn in at. And while I was doing all of this, I luckily got the nurse to move in. But I also ran out of wood while making the 4th house, so I had to make a midnight run into the void to find some trees. And now that I had more than enough wood to finish the 4th house, I decided to go ahead and make the 5th one as well, which is when I got the demolitionist to move in. At this point, I was feeling good enough to take on the first boss, which was gonna be the Eye of Cthulhu. So I started making my way over to the corruption biome so I could use a demon altar to craft its spawner, but ended up falling to my death. So I made my way back to the corruption biome again, only to fall into the hole right before the one I fell to my death in. This hole was filled with water, and I couldn't see anything, so I just restarted the world so I could spawn at my base, and decided to wait a bit until going back over there, mainly so I didn't have to embarrass myself for a 3rd time. So, once I was back in the world, I went to kill some demon eyes, and then, once it was day, I started building the next 2 houses. Did a little mining before dying, which is where I found enough gold to craft a golden helmet and chest piece. After this, I finally started making my way back over to the corruption biome, and this time, I actually got down one of the holes and found an altar, which is where I was able to make 2 suspicious looking eyes. By the time I got back to my base, it was still daytime, so I went ahead and made the platform I was going to use in the fight. And then, once it was finally night, I spawned the Eye of Cthulhu. The fight ended up being pretty long, since I didn't make my platform long enough, so I fell off a couple times. And then, on top of that, none of my weapons at that time could deal large amounts of damage, but eventually, I beat it. I decided to go ahead and use my other suspicious eye the next night, but shortly after spawning it in, I fell off my platform and died. After this, I decided to use the demonite I got by crafting a war axe, and then I started working on building my storage building on top of the platform I made for the boss fight. And during that process, I ended up getting the dryad to move in. Once it was night though, I decided to use my remaining lens to fight the Eye of Cthulhu one more time, which luckily got me enough demonite to make a bow. At this point, I was getting a little tired of just working on the normal Terraria progression, so I decided to go see what the Underworld was like in this version, as I was gonna need to go down there later on anyway. So, after dying more times than I would like to admit trying to make my elevator, I finally made it, and ended up dying pretty fast while trying to fight a demon. So, I called it quits on this side quest, and went back to working on the normal progression. The next boss I had on my checklist was the Eater of Worlds, so I bought some purification powder from the Dryad, alongside some bombs from the Demolitionist, and then started making my way towards the corruption biome. Once I got there, I started on breaking the orbs, and after dying twice, I finally broke the third and final Shadow Orb, which spawned the Eater of Worlds, but I ended up dying not too long into the fight. On the literal bright side though, I ended up getting the only pet in this version, the Shadow Orb Light Pet, and as you probably noticed by now, it was originally yellow instead of purple up until the 1.2 update. Once I respawned back at my base, I started doing some building, before I realized I had a meteor land just beside my base. So I spent some time mining that, but it was during this that I realized I haven't explored any part of the left side of my world. So that's what I went to do, after dropping my meteor stuff back at my house. The left side of my world wasn't too bad to get through, other than the desert. In this version of the game, cactus will actually hurt you if you touch it, and since cactus can regrow pretty fast in this game, alongside there being a ton of them, navigating it was more time consuming than I'd like to admit. The desert ended at the dungeon, so I decided to go ahead and make a stone path going over the desert to the dungeon, as I knew I'd be going to it a lot. And since I happen to have a platform right outside of the dungeon, I decided that I might as well try to fight Skeletron while I'm here. So after wasting time while waiting for night, I finally talked to the old man and spawned in Skeletron. This fight was pretty long, and although I did come close to dying more than a few times, I eventually won the fight by jumping and using my bow. After that, I obviously decided to go explore the dungeon, and not too far down, I found a demon altar, so I went ahead and made another Eye of Cthulhu spawner. After that, I kept on going down, up until I got sniped by a Tim not too long after leaving the altar. So, once I respawned, I did some building, alongside cutting down the first trees to grow on top of my base. Not too long after this, the clothier moved in while I finished building my item storage building, but then a blood moon started. So I stopped building to wait it out, as my base wasn't set up enough to stop the enemies from getting onto the top layer, which just happened to be where I was building. Once that was done and over with though, I went back over to the dungeon to try and explore it again, and while I did get a tad farther than I did last time, I ended up dying again. So, after making my way back over to the dungeon for another time, I actually ended up being able to explore it, and ended up finding a few keys and a Muramasa. But eventually, deep in the dungeon, I ended up dying to spikes and a blazing wheel. Once I was back home, I did some item organization, and then decided that I would try to take on the Eater of Worlds again. So I made my way over to the corruption biome, and started by making a platform, so that it'd have a solid flat floor to fight on. And then I started breaking 3 Shadow Orbs, until the Eater of Worlds spawned. This fight was pretty tough, as my platform didn't end up being long enough. But with enough potions and luck, I was finally able to defeat it, leaving only one boss left in this version, which is King Slime. After that, I went back home and used the demonite I just got to craft a demonite pickaxe, and I had just enough left to make some leggings as well, finally giving me a full set of armor, which is something I've been putting off doing so far. I then decided to go ahead and use the Eye of Cthulhu spawner I made earlier when I first got to the dungeon. And although my goal was to get enough demonite to make more armor, I decided to make the Light's Bane instead, since I was gonna need it for the Night's Edge in the future. So after that, I did a little more building to waste time until it was day. And once it was day, I went over to the corruption biome to get some more demonite, which allowed me to make the shadow helmet. This was also when I got serious about finishing my item storage building, so I spent a while setting that up, with each floor being dedicated to a specific type of item. Once I was finally happy with the storage setup, I went back to the corruption again to get more demonite, so I could craft the last armor piece from the demonite set. But instead of mining it like I did last time, I decided to fight the Eater of Worlds again, just to shake things up a bit for my sake. This fight luckily gave me enough to craft the shadow chest piece, giving me a full set of shadow armor. At this point, I was thinking what I'd do if another blood moon happened, so I went ahead and made a little AFK lava farm to the left of my base just for that. After that though, it was finally time for me to stop pushing off the hard things, which is getting Hellstone. So I made my way down to the Underworld and painfully mined a good bit of Hellstone, which is when I also managed to get a voodoo doll. After I eventually died and respawned back at my base, I used the Hellstone to craft some bars, which allowed me to make a full set of Hellstone tools, including the Volcano, which is also known as the Fiery Greatsword in this version of the game. With these new tools, alongside the obsidian skull I made, I could finally mine out the rest of the meteor without having to worry about dying. Or at least I thought, as I still ended up dying. Once I finished that though, I ended up with enough meteorite to make the meteor helmet. And now that my gear was a lot better, I wanted to see what the voodoo doll did in this version, as I knew the wall of flesh wasn't in it. So, after dying 2 times trying to get to a pit of lava to throw the doll in, I finally got there and threw the doll in. Just like today's version of Terraria, it did kill the guide NPC, but that was it, nothing else. So, seemingly, the doll was just added to mess with the guide. After being slightly disappointed with that, I moved on to making a new building for all the crafting stations, right beside the item storage one. And I was able to use it shortly after making it, as after another long trip to the Underworld, I was able to craft a full set of molten armor. And now that I had arguably the best armor in this version, it was time to get arguably the best sword in this version, which is the Knight's Edge. Luckily, I already had 3 out of the 4 swords needed to craft it, with the only remaining one being the Blade of Grass. So, after a confusing search to figure out how to craft the Blade of Grass in this version of Terraria, I made my way over to the jungle and started collecting all of the materials I needed for it. Once I had all that, I went back home to craft it, and then I took it, alongside the other 3 swords I already had, down into the corruption biome, which is where I was finally able to craft the Knight's Edge. And at this point, we only had a few days left out of the original 100 days, but we still needed to fight King Slime. Up until now, I was just assuming I could spawn him in like you do in today's version of Terraria. But instead, it just has a random chance to spawn in once you're 1/3 away from your spawn. And while I did do that, I could never get King Slime to spawn in. So, once it got down to the last 2 days, I just decided to go back to my base and spend the last little bit of time building up my base, which is where this playthrough ends at. And like most of my playthroughs, I'm gonna publish the world I played on in this video, but I'm gonna be putting out 2 other things as well. To start, since I noticed that there's no Builder's Workshop map for this version, in fact, it seems like it was trendy in this version to empty chests entirely before publishing maps, I went ahead and made one that has every item in modded stacks, alongside each of the crafting stations, even including the demon altars. And aside from those 2 maps, I also released a texture pack that changes Terraria's texture back into their Undeluxe versions, like the Yellow Shadow Orb. So, if you want to get either of these maps, or the texture pack, then you can find the world files on my Discord. And you can get the texture pack on the Steam Workshop, but you will have to manually install them into the Undeluxe version if you want to play them in that version. And that wraps up this video. I know this video was on the short end compared to what I've been putting out recently, but luckily, like I mentioned at the start, that's only because I'm working on 2 other large videos, which hopefully will be out very soon. Thanks for sticking to the end. Be sure to like and subscribe for more Terraria videos like this in the future. And, like always, make sure to have a wonderful day.